There's a room that does not appear on any diplomatic map. No placard on the door, no flag, no official record that the meeting ever happened. And yet, what was decided inside that room changed the balance of power between the United States and Iran. Not through missiles, not through sanctions, not through the kind of brute geopolitical force the world expects from Washington. It was changed through a conversation, a very specific conversation in a very specific city, conducted by a country that the world has spent decades underestimating. The question is, how does a nation that is constantly sanctioned, perpetually pressured, and routinely dismissed as a secondary player, how does that country pull off the most consequential diplomatic achievement of the modern era? That is what you are about to find out. Before we go further, understand something. The story you are about to hear is not in any headline. It will not be confirmed by any embassy spokesperson. The official narrative, the one released to the press, is technically true and almost entirely uninformative. It describes what happened. It tells you almost nothing about how. And the how is where all the power is. Welcome to Power Matrix. Somewhere in Islamabad, in a private residence belonging to a retired Pakistani general, a framework was described out loud for the first time, not in the sterile language of diplomatic cables, not in the cautious grammar of a UN resolution. It was spoken the way serious things are spoken between serious people who have known each other long enough to skip the theater. On one side of this conflict, the United States, the most powerful military force on Earth, with aircraft carriers positioned in the Gulf, with the full weight of its intelligence apparatus focused on Iran, and with a domestic political establishment that had spent years insisting it would never negotiate from a position of weakness. On the other side, Iran, a country under suffocating economic pressure whose military had been in active confrontation with American assets for weeks. A country led by a political structure that is layered, fractured, and intensely sensitive to any outcome that could be framed internally as capitulation. Neither side was willing to blink first. Both sides were privately desperate for a way out. That is the gap Pakistan walked into, not by accident, by design. Here is what most people do not understand about Pakistan's position in the global order. Pakistan sits at the exact intersection of 4 of the world's most powerful gravitational fields. It borders Iran. It has been a military partner to the United States for decades. It is economically tied to China through one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects on Earth. And it has deep, decades-long military and intelligence relationships with the Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and beyond. That combination does not exist anywhere else on the planet. What it produces is something extraordinary. A country that knows things, real things, not the things that are communicated through official channels, where every word is filtered through layers of political calculation and public narrative management. Pakistan knows the things that are communicated between intelligence officers who have spent years managing shared problems, border security, sectarian dynamics, nuclear fears, and who have built over that time the kind of trust that survives regime changes and political transitions. Pakistan's inter-services intelligence maintains back channels into Iranian decision, making that the American intelligence community simply cannot replicate. The ISI and the IRGC, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, have years of quiet coordination on border security and sectarian monitoring. That coordination created infrastructure, communication channels that exist outside of any official diplomatic framework. Channels with enough trust on both sides to carry sensitive, honest information without the distortion that comes from intermediaries with their own agendas. When Pakistan activated those channels, it was not to share secrets. It was to listen, to probe, to ask very carefully. For in the language that only long-established back channels can carry, what Iran actually needed for a ceasefire to be politically survivable at home. What came back was not the 10-point public document that Iran had formally submitted. That document was a maximum position, constructed to give Iranian negotiators room to maneuver, designed to look like a serious opening offer that was then bargained down toward a predetermined destination. It was theater. Good theater, but theater. The actual Iranian minimum had 4 elements. First, an American statement acknowledging Iran's right to exist as a sovereign state, not an endorsement of Iran's nuclear program, but language that Iranian domestic communication could present as a rejection of the regime, change agenda that Tehran had always believed was Washington's true goal. That distinction mattered enormously. The words did not have to say much. They had to say the right thing. Second, a Palestinian rights commitment. But here is where Pakistan's understanding went deeper than anyone else's. Iran's position on Palestine was never purely about the substance of any Palestinian state framework. It was about the framing, who was endorsing it, whose framework it was. A Palestinian rights commitment embedded in an Islamic military coalition declaration, a multilateral Muslim world document, served Iranian domestic politics differently than the same language inside a bilateral American. Iranian agreement. Even if the words were identical, the institutional wrapper changed everything. Third, a financial relief mechanism that produced visible economic benefit for ordinary Iranians within 30 days of any agreement being signed. Not comprehensive sanctions relief, not the transformation of the Iranian economy. A specific, limited, verifiable signal that arrived quickly enough for the Iranian government to point to it and say, this is already working. Fourth, American acknowledgement of the Islamic military coalition as a legitimate regional security institution. Not an endorsement of the coalition's objectives, not a blessing of its activities, simply recognition that it exists as a real institution. 4 words of diplomatic reality that meant almost nothing to American strategic interests, and meant everything to the coalition's standing in the Muslim world. These 4 elements were the real deal. Everything else was negotiating decoration. Now here is where it gets interesting. Because Washington did not want any of this. Not because the 4 elements were unacceptable in substance. They were, in fact, largely achievable within the legal authority the American executive already possessed. Washington's resistance was about something else entirely. It was about process ownership, about the deeply embedded American assumption that wherever American interests are at stake, American power should be setting the agenda. And the Islamabad framework had been designed, constructed, and presented by Pakistan, with Iran's minimum already mapped and the language already drafted, before Washington had been meaningfully consulted. America was being handed a solution it did not build. That was the problem. The internal debates in Washington were not primarily about whether the framework's terms served American interests. The intelligence community kept telling the interagency process that they did. The debates were about whether accepting a process that American agencies did not design was a precedent Washington could afford to set. The State Department, the National Security Council, the intelligence apparatus, each had institutional reasons to prefer a framework they could shape over one they were being asked to join. And then the weight of reality intervened. A cyber attack cut power to Isfahan. An assessment from one of the world's most watched financial institutions concluded that recession was already underway. The fractures in Washington's regional alliance architecture became too visible to ignore, and the operational costs of continuation began to outweigh the cost of accepting a process Washington did not own. At that moment, Washington moved. Not because Pakistan forced it, because Pakistan had built a situation in which the Islamabad framework was, by a significant margin, the most rational available option. And then Pakistan did something just as important. It gave Washington a way to say yes without appearing to have blinked. The framework was presented not as a Pakistani initiative, but as a product of regional collective action. The Islamic military coalition's institutional endorsement gave it multilateral character. Saudi Arabia's explicit support gave it Gulf monarchical credibility, the kind of framing that allowed American officials to characterize the outcome as consistent with alliance management rather than as a concession to a Pakistani-mediated process. The language of the most sensitive elements, Iranian sovereignty, coalition recognition, Palestinian rights framing, was engineered with sufficient legal ambiguity that American lawyers could interpret it one way and Iranian lawyers could interpret it another. Both readings served their respective domestic audiences. Neither reading was wrong. That was the point. There were 3 moments when the entire framework nearly collapsed. The first came when Israeli intelligence, operating through American liaison channels, characterized the framework's emerging terms as a capitulation that would legitimize Iranian nuclear development. The characterization was directionally accurate and factually imprecise. It reached the American interagency process, before the framework's language had been finalized to address the specific Israeli concerns. Pakistan's response was surgical. The sovereignty acknowledgement language was modified to include explicit reference to non-proliferation verification regimes, language that did not give America the inspection rights its maximum position had demanded, but gave American officials enough architecture to call the framework consistent with non-proliferation commitments. The Israeli alarm was not eliminated. It was reduced below the threshold that would have triggered a veto. The second near collapse came from the American Treasury Department, which identified specific sanctions categories whose relief within 30 days of signing would create legal complications under domestic legislation that the executive could not unilaterally waive. The 30-day timeline was Iran's hard requirement. The legal obstacle was real. Pakistan's solution was to work with the Saudi financial architecture to identify mechanisms through which the 30-day economic signal could be delivered through Gulf financial channels. Saudi Arabia making specific financial commitments to Iranian connected trading partners without requiring American statutory action on the problematic categories. What had been a legal obstacle became an opportunity. Saudi Arabia's financial commitment to the 30-day mechanism embedded Riyadh more deeply in the framework's architecture, advancing the coalition's institutional position in exactly the way MBS had been building toward. The third near collapse was the most dangerous. 3 weeks in, The Iranian delegation in Islamabad received internal communication from hardline factions within the IRGC political office arguing that the framework's Palestinian rights language was insufficiently explicit about Israeli accountability, and that the framework itself was evidence that Iran had been coerced into a position its military capabilities should have prevented. This was not primarily a language dispute. It was an internal Iranian political battle between pragmatists who saw the ceasefire as Iran's best available exit, and hardliners who needed to believe the alternative was viable. Pakistan's response was the most delicate intervention of the entire process. Through the same IRGC channel that had established the minimum in the first place, Pakistani mediators communicated an honest assessment. Not a threat, not diplomatic pressure, but a specific, evidence-based analysis of what continuation would cost Iran militarily, infrastructurally, and economically in light of the vulnerabilities the conflict had already exposed. It was delivered through a channel the IRGC's political office trusted as independent of American manipulation. It was received as intelligence rather than coercion. It did not eliminate the hardliner opposition, but it shifted enough institutional weight within the IRGC political office toward engagement that the delegation in Islamabad received authorization to continue rather than the recall the hardliners had been demanding. The framework survived all three of those moments, not through grand design, through sequential obstacle removal, identifying exactly what would cause each party to walk away at each specific stage, and finding a solution narrow enough to remove that obstacle without creating a new one that another party could not navigate. This is what diplomacy actually looks like when it works. Not the press conference, not the handshake photograph, the invisible architecture that makes the handshake possible. Think about what this means for the global order going forward. A country that has been sanctioned, pressured, and characterized as unreliable delivered an outcome that the world's most powerful military and diplomatic apparatus could generate the pressure for, but could not close. The gap between what American power could produce and what Pakistani mediation could deliver is now visible to every government that will need a mediator in the next conflict. And those governments are already drawing the lesson. Pakistan got something too. Not territory, not money. Something more durable, legitimacy. The kind of legitimacy that comes from being the country that solved the problem everyone else said was unsolvable, in a region where perception of capability is itself a form of power that is not a small thing. Iran got its minimum, the four elements it actually needed. Were Khazar wrapped in institutional framing that its domestic political communication required. America got the strategic outcome its intelligence community had assessed it needed, delivered through a process it did not design, framed in language it could still call a diplomatic achievement. Saudi Arabia got coalition recognition that MBS had been building toward for a decade. Everyone received what they actually needed. Nobody publicly acknowledged that the other side had received anything at all. That is not an accident. It is the specific art of the Pakistani mediation, creating the linguistic and institutional architecture that allows incompatible public positions to coexist with a shared private outcome. The ceasefire that Washington never wanted is the ceasefire that Washington could not have produced through any process it controlled. Because the process Washington would have designed would never have been acceptable to Iran in any form that Iranian domestic politics could present as something other than surrender. Pakistan built it. Pakistan built it by knowing what neither side would tell the other, by constructing language precise enough to serve multiple competing narratives simultaneously, and by navigating three separate near collapses through channels that neither America nor Iran even knew Pakistan possessed. The official version of this story is that Pakistani mediation facilitated an agreement between parties whose interests had sufficiently aligned. That sentence is technically accurate. It is the diplomatic equivalent of saying the surgeon made an incision. True, profoundly incomplete. The real story, the one that tells you how power actually moves in this world, is the story of the building, the probe, the channel, the language, the three moments when it nearly fell apart, and the three specific interventions that saved it. That is the story you will not hear from any government, because all of them benefit more from the framework surviving than from the framework being accurately explained. The world's most consequential diplomatic achievement of this era happened in a room with no placard on the door, conducted by a country the world keeps underestimating. And the lesson it teaches about knowledge as leverage, about language as architecture, about the gap between stated positions and real minimums, is a lesson that will shape every negotiation that follows. Pay attention, because the next room without a placard on the door is already being arranged. Stay with Power Matrix, because this is where the real story lives.